It happens to all of us at one time or another. You're out for a road trip or a cruise at your classic car, and you stop to get gas or you stop to get something to eat. And as you're walking back up on the car, you see it's got a puddle of antifreeze under the nose. It's either coming from the radiator or some mysterious spot under the engine. And what do? You need a temporary fix. You've either got to get to your destination or get back to the house where you can make your permanent repairs. So what do? Your first instinct is to run to an auto parts store and get some stop leak. Right? Good temporary fix, right? Yeah, no, it's not a good idea. Stop leak, with one exception, we're going to talk about that towards the end of this video. Stop leak, the problem with stop leak is that it does its job too well and it doesn't have a mind of its own. See, stop leak can't determine whether the gap that it's going to fill is from the cooling system to the outside or an air or steam gap circulating inside the cooling system. So it'll treat them equally. Stop leak has a good chance of finding small passages inside the cooling system, or especially the heater core. I'll talk about the heater core in a second. And it will treat those air gaps as holes in the cooling system. So a perfect example of that, a very common example of that, are small steam holes that go from the head, from the block to the head. And it'll find those small passages, usually in the head gasket itself, and clog those. Now you've got limited circulation inside the engine. The heater core is most susceptible to damage by stop leak because the heater core is, generally speaking, mounted remotely and at a very high level. So the heater core almost always has some sort of air or steam pocket within itself. The stop leak finds those areas, treats them like leaks, and clogs them. So stop leak has that problem. It does its job too well, and it can't make that determination whether the leak is to the outside or it's inside. It just wants to fill any gap that it finds. And then there's also a side effect from it, and that's that after it's done circulating through the system, it'll gravitate down to the lowest parts of the cooling system and gather up there. If anybody who's ever torn apart an engine that's had a lot of stop leak put through it over the years knows exactly what I'm talking about. The bottom of the water jackets will start to clog up with this stuff. You don't get full circulation around the cylinders. It'll clog the bottom of the heater core. It'll gather up at the bottom of the radiator. It's just not something you want to use if you don't have to. So if you're not going to go to a parts store and buy stop leak, what do? Well, you go to a supermarket and you fix it with food. And yeah, that's food too. That's as edible as the rest of the stuff. And we're going to get to that. So you got three basic types of leaks that you're going to come across. You have your gushers, you have your drips, and you have your seepages. Depending on what you have is which treatment you want to use. So the gushers, generally speaking, this is going to happen in the radiator, and it's either going to be a puncture or it's going to be one of the tubes opens up or corrodes through. So now you've got a gush, you've got a steady stream of coolant. Well, for that, you want to use eggs. Now, there are many different things you can put into a cooling system to stop a leak that aren't stop leak. There's lots of home remedies, right? But these are proven. 100% of the time, they work. So a tube will open up or it'll corrode and you've got a gushing leak. The way eggs work with that is that, now you got to picture this. The cooling system, when it's full with water, it stands still in the radiator so it's cooled. When the thermostat opens, water is allowed to go from the engine into the top tank, and then at the same time, it's pulled through the bottom hose by the water pump, and anything that's in the tank gets sucked through the tubes. Well, during that journey through the tubes, the eggs will find those holes, will find those gaps, and fill them. To use the eggs, you want to make sure that the tank is topped off just a little tiny air gap at the top. Then you want to drop in 2, 3, 4 eggs. Doesn't matter. You can put as many as you want in there. There is no permanent harm done to the cooling system. The eggs hit the hot water, the hot stagnant water in the top tank, and they cook. Now, as soon as the stat opens and the hot water is allowed to transfer from the engine into the top tank, it gets pulled, the cooked eggs get pulled through the tubes. And on their journey through the tubes, they'll find the leak and they'll stop up the leak. It happens really fast too. Generally, within 3 or 4 minutes of dropping a few eggs into the top of a radiator, generally speaking, it takes 2 or 3 minutes, and the leak will stop. And once the leak stops, you don't want to put the cap on all the way. You want to put the cap on just its first stop, because when you put the cap on, it's got the first stop, which is right there, and it won't allow much pressure to be built inside the cooling system. Just 2 or 3 pounds, not enough to blow the eggs through. Now, if you go to the next stop, which locks the cap down, sucks the cap down, now you're dealing with 14, 15, 16 pounds, whatever the cap is rated for, and the egg will not stand up to that kind of pressure. When you get to around 8, 10 pounds or so, it'll just blow the eggs right out. So for your temporary fix to get the car home, you just want to put the cap on as loosely as possible. Get home and you'll be good. There's no permanent damage done to this, because as those egg bits get circulated through the system and get whipped into, they become just part of the liquid. They homogenize into the cooling system, and they don't really form any deposits anywhere. So eggs are for your squirters or your gushers. Now, black pepper works best for the dripping type of leaks. So it's not like a steady gush, but it's like a drip, drip, drip. And it's the same thing with those tubes. The tube corroded or opened up a little bit, or it got punctured, and it's got just a tiny bit of a leak to it. So same situation. You want to fill the radiator with water. You want to drop a whole thing of ground black pepper in there. Not fine ground black, just regular ground black pepper. Use the whole container. You drop it in there. As soon as it hits the hot water, it starts to expand it. It sucks in some of the water, it starts to expand. And you've got that same situation where when the thermostat opens, anything that's in the top tank gets pulled through the tubes. And on its way through the tubes, the black pepper will find those smaller leaks and it'll clog them up. Now the black pepper, the thing about black pepper is that it'll fool you because it'll hang in there for a really long time. The eggs, not so much. They're fragile. But once the black pepper finds those holes, and after, let's say, 50, 100 miles, a couple of heating and cooling cycles, well, this stuff will really solidify in that hole. And it'll give you the illusion that it's repaired. You can actually, once you've got a black pepper repair done on your radiator, it'll fool you, and you'll close the cap all the way, and you can probably drive it for 100 miles, 1,000 miles, and it'll hold, but it's still temporary, and it will pop through. Like the eggs, the black pepper, no detrimental effects. It'll just find its way through the cooling system, and it'll just stick to random things, but not cause the kind of cloggage that stop leak it would cause. And you'll never hurt your heater core or anything like that with black pepper. Now, you've got a seep. Now, the seep is very loosely defined, but it's not a gusher and it's not a drip, but it's wetness. It's just a seeping kind of leak. And most of the time you're going to find that's going to be not in the radiator, but it's going to be one of the core plugs. Of course, core plugs, they rust. As they get old, they rust. And then eventually they rust to the point where they become porous, and they'll start to seep water, and you'll get little puddles under the engine. Okay, so that's where this stuff comes in handy. And like I said, it's edible. These pellets were actually used by General Motors for, I guess it was around 1994, 1995. These pellets actually became standard addition to General Motors cooling systems from around 1995 to around 2000, 2001. Because what happened was, when they introduced the North Star had some casting issues. The castings were porous. Some of them were so porous that oil would actually sweat from through the crankcase to the outer part of the block. It was bad. That same porosity affected the cooling system. Now, these General Motors recommended, or actually mandated, that you use these tabs, and they were labeled as AC Delco tabs, and they had an AC Delco part number on them, that these tabs be included anytime you flush the cooling system. They started with the North Stars, but they actually, across the board, across the whole line, they recommended these, or they mandated that you use these cooling system tabs so that it would defeat any porosity in the castings. They are completely edible. These are the same formulation that General Motors uses. This is Barsleek uses these. So they're made up of ginger root, crushed almond shells, and turmeric. So they're almost like a new age health supplement. You can eat these, they're fine. So these tabs, the way you're supposed to put them in, the way you're supposed to install them, at least the way General Motors said, was that you're supposed to crush these up and you're supposed to put them in the bottom hose of the radiator. Why they did that specifically, I don't know. You can't put these in a remote tank, like if you've got a remote cooling tank that you would normally fill with water, you don't want to put them in there. They actually have to go directly into the cooling system. So these things work on like a microscopic level. They break up, you put them in as, well, you can put them in as tabs, but you're supposed to crush them up. You put them in the radiator, and they'll circulate through the cooling system, and they'll, let's say, they'll cover all of the walls, all of these surfaces within the cooling system, but on a very fine, almost microscopic level. So basically what you're doing is you're coating the inside of the whole cooling system with the ginger root, turmeric, and almond shell mixture. And there's zero negative side effects. There is no chance of this stuff clogging any major passages. The chances of this working on either a gushing leak that you would use like the eggs for, or a dripping leak like you would use the black pepper for, are kind of slim to none. I've never seen these work successfully in any of those. But if you've got seeping core plugs, freeze plugs, core plugs, whatever you want to call them, this stuff will work. Same thing with head gaskets. If you've got a seeping head gasket, like it's seeping from, let's say, the deck surface to the outside of the cylinder head, the outside of the block, so it's not leaking, but it's seeping, this stuff will actually work for that. So, and like I said, you can eat them. You could probably make the eggs, cover them with the black pepper, crush some of these up, sprinkle it all over that. You've got like a healthy kind of, I wouldn't eat it, but you've got a healthy kind of meal. And ways to fix your car that won't kill the rest of your cooling system. So there you go. Home remedies, fix it with food. But really, fix it, because none of this stuff is permanent. Always remember that. None of these things are permanent. You can get sucked into that real easy. Any type of additive, any type of thing you use to stop a leak in your cooling system should always be considered temporary, and never go for the second treatments, because that's where you start to add, you get into problems. Well, it worked to get me home, now it's leaking a little bit more, I'll throw a little bit more in. No, that's like a doom loop for your cooling system. Fix the problem the right way. All right, I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.